Now, before we come to this extraordinary work you've done on perceptions, can you talk a little bit about the earlier work you did on the tribes? You've talked about the 67% exhausteds and the smaller groupings who seem to get all the airplay and who fight the warfare that we hear about and see on our television sets that's exhausted the rest of us. Can you just work us through those tribes?
So what we did with this study was a very big national sample across the United States, 8,000 people. We had social scientists from Yale University working on it. And what we were trying to do was get beyond the story that the country is 50-50 divided on, all these issues, these polarizing issues, immigration, racism, feminism, police brutality. A lot of questions you can ask in the United States, you'll get these 50-50 answers. And so the dominant narrative has been that's what we are. But when we went and asked people's perspectives on more what's their fundamental values and worldview, what shapes who they feel they are, how do they feel about the future, etc. And we asked a lot of questions that were based on this sort of what we call core beliefs framework. We found that it's not a story of 50-50 at all. In fact, there's large majorities for a lot of sort of common sense propositions, but the debate's being driven by two extremes, 6% at one end, 8% at the other end. And they're dominating because they're kind of loud on social media. They're the activists, conservative activists, progressive activists, but the majority of people are not that. But the other thing that we found is, there's a traditional liberal group, a traditional conservative group who are small c conservative in wanting to maintain institutions, concerned with compromise, etc. And then you've got these middle groups who don't really have a political identity. And that's where we've done particular, I think, interesting work around, there's one group called the politically disengaged, 26% of the population. It's the largest single group in the US. And they just don't define themselves politically. They're not left or right. They have different views on immigration on an issue like welfare to something like taxes, but most of all they're characterised by very low social trust. They just don't believe in the institutions. They don't believe in other people. They're alienated. They're lonely, and they're very vulnerable to an us versus them kind of populist narrative because they don't feel very vested in their society. And we have a couple of other groups, so no need to sort of go into all of it. It's all online, but we're getting to the texture of what does the country look like. Now, you read that and you look at we had a lot of one-on-one interviews as well. You stand back from it and then you say, okay, this is a much more nuanced picture than a 50-50 story. And it is possible to build strong majorities if you have a story of inclusion, a story of respect, a story that's based around the things that we share in common, the more in common kind of message. And that's where the frustration, when you watch the way in which politics is playing out, the frustration I have is we actually know from deep research that most important things people have in common, share similar aspirations for their future. Yes, there are differences, they're all differences that we can manage, but right now it feels like we can't do that.
As I hear about these tribes, I can't help thinking to myself, I wonder which one I fit into.
Well, you can actually get an answer to that question. You have to sort of pretend that you're American because some of the questions are specific to US context. But you actually on the hiddentribes.us website, you can go there and you can, it takes about 8 minutes. You fill in a bunch of questions about your sort of worldview and core beliefs, and you can find out which tribe you belong to.
I think that's tremendous. Are you going to do it for us in Australia at some stage?
I would love to. One of the challenges is that this sort of work depends on significant philanthropic support. Australia doesn't have that kind of base of support. It's harder to get. But I would love to do it because I do think that just new ways of trying to unpack what's happening in your society are just so valuable at this moment of kind of disruption and change. So yeah, I would love to.
Well, there might be someone out there who's grabbed by the idea. But it would seem to me to be very.
Yeah, no, I think something like this would be just very helpful to. We need to tell a story of who we are as Australians, tell a bigger, inclusive story of us and our future that brings everybody in, that doesn't exclude anybody on the basis of whatever background, history, identity, etc. And to do that, we need to know who we are now. And what are the differences, and what are the points of fracture and the points of commonality, and especially it's the points of commonality. So we're doing this in a bunch of other countries, United Kingdom, France and Germany, and it would be great to be able to do that here at some point in the future too. Yeah.
So that takes us into the area of perceptions, reality versus perceptions. you've done some later work that's really profoundly interesting and quite disturbing about the way in which even highly educated people at one end of the spectrum, say an enclave of Democrats, versus a highly educated enclave of Republicans in another area, can so completely and seriously misunderstand one another that there's no common ground at all, even though people in the middle, as you say, have a lot of common ground, as you'd expect in any civil society.
Yeah, we were asking this question. So our assumption is that what's driving tribalism in part is that we don't actually understand the point of view of the other side. And we wanted to test, okay, can we empirically test? What do we take what Republicans think about, let's say, an issue like immigration, the role of Muslims, and what they think Democrats think about the patriotism of the country. And we asked them their beliefs, and then we asked the Democrats, what do you think their beliefs are? And we did the same the other way around. What we found was that on both sides, they're wildly exaggerating the proportion of people with extreme views. So, for example, half of Republicans think that Democrats think that most police are bad people. Well, actually, the number's only 15%. It's
Really?
a third of what they think. Likewise, we asked Democrats, how many Republicans do you think don't believe that a Muslim could ever be a good American? So it's a question about, how much racial prejudice do they hold? Well, they say, 2/3 of Republicans were like that. Well, the answer is 1/3. It's less than 1/3. So we found that the more extreme views, of course, yes, there are extreme views on both sides, but they're much, much smaller. Typically, we are exaggerating by a factor of 2 to 3 times the actual number on both sides. Now, yes, when you go then deeper into the research, what's driving that? We looked at media habits and we looked at education levels and a variety of other things. And what we found was in media habits, a lot of exposure to media doesn't actually make you better informed about the views of people on the other side of the fence. In fact, the best thing for you to do is to basically have no media exposure, which is a terrible reflection. Literally, for almost every form of media other than network news, nightly network news, traditional TV news, people's exposure is, the more exposed they are to media, the more they misjudge the other side.
Mainstream media or social media?
Mainstream and social media, because in the United States context, a lot of it is partisan media, whether it's the Fox world or the MSNBC world. But then there are some good insights. If you're a Democrat, then you should listen to religious broadcasting, religious news services, or conservative talk radio, and that'll help you to understand the views of the other side. If you're a conservative, then it's exposure to things like NPR, MSNBC, and so forth that will help you to better understand. But people don't have a balanced media diet anymore, so that's one part of it. The other piece that we did was looked at education levels. And we found this very strange outcome that was showing the opposite relationship between education and understanding other people than what you'd expect. That is, the Democrat who best understands the values of the average Republican hasn't finished high school. And at every level of education, as you get more educated, a Democrat has a bigger perception gap, a bigger misunderstanding. And strangely, the only group of Democrats, overall Republicans generally have a bigger perception gap, misunderstand more. But when you get to a Democrat with a postgrad degree, they're actually the worst of all groups in their misperception. They have a caricatured view of the average Republican. And there's obviously something wrong if our education, higher levels of education, are creating an increase in the level of misunderstanding of the views of people on the other side. So I think that this is an attempt to sort of try to get deeper to understand what's driving. Because if you don't understand the views of the other side, if you have this caricature view, if you think that every Republican is a sort of frothing at the mouth, sort of racist, etc., then you will not be prepared to make any compromises and you will fight to the death against the other side. And unfortunately, on both ends, if you look at your commentary on social media, you can see it's this sort of view that the most extreme view that you hear from people on the other side is the norm. And I've reflected on this a lot in my personal life and realised that very often, it's an easy thing in psychology. You think of the people who've criticised you or your side, and you hear an extreme view and you think, oh, they all think like that. But whenever I've had personal experience of the other side, the group, I've realised that no, it's not true at all.
This is a point Neil Ferguson makes. If you're going to hate someone and take them down, you must not meet them. You must not develop any empathy. Because if you meet somebody and have to look them in the eye and talk, you actually realise they're a fellow human being. And they're nowhere near as bad as you thought. And you're not as good as you thought. So, we've got this problem, as I understand it, with social media dominance that, it's so easy to set yourself up to only get one line of thinking. And I think it's 40% of Americans now get no mainstream news whatsoever. It's all social media. And the bad news, the fake news, travels much faster than accurate news.
Yeah, and it's optimised to do that, exactly.
Yeah.
So I
this
think
tricky business of algorithms, we're all being manipulated.
Right. Absolutely, yeah. And Sean Parker, one of the founders of Facebook, he says this is a system which was built to exploit the vulnerabilities of human psychology. We have never had an instrument.
No,
like
we haven't.
that.
This is the dangerous new era we're in.
And I think this is why have we entered this period in the last few years of what feels like chaotic disruption, and a kind of
because it's accelerating very rapidly,
extremely fast. And we could think of 15 countries where insurgent nationalist populism poses a fundamental threat to people's rights and to democracy that just wasn't the case even 10 years ago. And they're very different countries and very different systems. Of course, my work is across different. So in every country, you have a conversation where people are saying, well, this is all about Brexit, or this is all about the refugees who came here in Germany, or in America, this is all about Trump. But it's like when you stand back from it, say, no. Very similar forces are at work everywhere. And what's the one factor that has been most dramatic? I mean, yes, financial crisis and there's economic factors, but it's social media.
It's social media.
It's transformed our information environment and the way that we connect to each other. That's profound. I don't know that there's any in history that there's anything that's so quickly sort of entered into the way in which
only the printing presses is the only analogy you can think of 500 years ago. And it proved to be more disruptive and created more mayhem and unpleasantness than was expected at the time. Ultimately, it proved to be a good thing.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.